Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into a really fascinating work, God and Universe by Pietro Ubaldi.
Right. And the story behind it is pretty wild.
It really is. Get this. 1951, Ubaldi's sick with bronchitis, he's got a fever, he's alone in Gubbio, and in just 20 nights, boom, this whole book emerges.
Yeah, it's like that intense discomfort and isolation just became this channel for something big.
Definitely. And the book itself, I mean, the ambition is huge.
Totally. It goes straight for the biggest questions,
Yeah.
God, the universe, existence itself. Ubaldi wasn't shy about going beyond what science could say then into what he called the theological.
That's a bold move trying to knit all that together.
It is. And like context is important here. This wasn't just a one-off.
Right, it's part of a bigger project, Volume 10, wasn't it?
Exactly. His whole thing was trying to bring clarity to these massive fundamental questions.
And Einstein, even Einstein was impressed by an earlier book, right? Mentioned the language, the sheer scope.
Yeah, the force of language and the vast extension of interest, I think was the phrase, which, coming from Einstein,
That definitely makes you sit up and take notice.
it does. So for us today, diving into this book, God and Universe, our goal is basically to unpack some key ideas.
Like his take on where everything came from.
Yeah, the origin, this idea of a fall of spirits, why he thought reincarnation was like totally necessary for spiritual growth.
And how it all leads back to unity with God. It's a unique perspective, for sure.
Very distinctive. Offers a whole framework for these massive questions.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe with his thoughts on theology itself. He had some strong opinions there.
Oh, definitely. He wasn't pulling any punches. He felt traditional theology had kind of stalled out.
Yeah, like it was just repeating itself, stuck in old ways, not offering new proofs or deeper ideas about redemption for, like, centuries.
Stuck in the scholastic tradition, as he saw it.
Yeah.
His point was, each era has its own language, its own problems.
So theology needs to keep up, like science does.
Exactly. He even speculated that future thinkers might come up with theological insights that make our current stuff look like, well, rough drafts.
That's a challenging thought. Makes you wonder. Okay, so moving on to creation itself, this idea of a single creation of spirits and then a fall. What's that about?
Right. He saw it in two phases. First, this involutive descent, spirits moving down into matter.
Involution, like folding inward into density.
Kind of, yeah, from pure spirit into the physical. Then phase two is the evolutive ascent, the climb back up towards spirit. That's the journey we're on.
And reincarnation is key to that ascent.
Absolutely key. Not just possible, but necessary in his view. It's a direct result of the fall into matter.
So spirits have to keep coming back.
Yes, to experience life in matter, which he saw as a product of the fall and through all the trials, the pain, gradually spiritualize it, learn the lessons.
And that's how they eventually get back to God.
That's the mechanism, yeah. It's a required path for evolution. And interestingly, while he wasn't maybe a card-carrying spiritist on every point, he felt his system totally backed up their core idea of reincarnation.
Okay, so this cycle, down into matter, then up through repeated lives to spiritualize it. Got it. That sort of sets the scene for some of his predictions, maybe.
It does, like these two paths he talked about. And this connects to that message he sent to Mussolini back in 32.
Oh, yeah, the warning against war. And predicting a new humanity after some global chaos.
Exactly. He saw two ways that could happen. Path one, we smarten up, choose love, make a spontaneous correction.
Unlikely, maybe.
Well, path two was the alternative. A huge, destructive war that basically clears the slate, and a new spiritual civilization rises from the ruins.
And he saw materialism as the big problem pushing us towards path two, like a disease.
Yeah, he called it humanity's sickness, leading us to a surgical table, as he put it.
And the prediction about the year 2000.
Right. He thought by then this operation would be done. He even suggested the atomic bomb, a product of that materialism, might be the instrument used to liquidate it.
Which obviously didn't happen exactly like that.
No. But looking back, you can see it less as a literal timetable and more as a stark warning, maybe, about where unchecked materialism could lead, the self-destructive potential.
Right, the bomb as a symbol of that self-destruction. And where does Satan fit into this? That sounds pretty dramatic.
Well, again, it's not quite the traditional pitchfork-wielding figure. For Ubaldi, Satan is more like the negative principle itself, the force behind that destructive path, the resistance, the separation.
Okay.
But here's the twist. He saw this negative force, paradoxically, as preparing the ground for the new spiritual age. A bit like, Judas's role in the redemption story, though obviously very different contexts.
Well, even the negative serves a purpose in the bigger picture.
That's the implication. A challenging idea, definitely,
Yeah.
that destruction can inadvertently pave the way for construction.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Ubaldi had this framework for Christianity's development over millennia, right? These three trilogies.
Yes, a three-act structure. First millennium,
Hmm.
basically getting Christ's idea materially established in the world, planting the seeds.
Okay.
Second millennium, more rational development, trying to figure it out intellectually, society's partially absorbing it. But he used this metaphor like Christ was still sort of asleep in the tomb then.
And the third millennium, our time, is the big awakening.
That's the idea, the sublimation, the resurrection in the spirit. Christ rises again spiritually. The core gospel message starts to be truly lived collectively.
Leading to the kingdom of God on earth, a unified world.
That was his anticipation. Greater unity, peace, guided by Christ's spiritual principles finally taking root.
It's interesting that pattern of three keeps popping up. Jesus' ministry, the trilogies, resurrection on the third day. He even connects it to Dante.
Yeah, the Divine Comedy's three parts. It does suggest he saw this deep recurring pattern in spiritual history. Whether he structured it that way or just observed it, it gives his vision a sense of almost architectural design.
Right. Okay, let's dive into something more philosophical. His ideas about using these interactions with the wind, the plant, the animal.
Ah, yes, the allegories. They're quite revealing. Each represents a different level of consciousness with its own limits and drives.
The simple I am.
Exactly. The wind just is following physical laws. The plant is focused on its own survival, kind of egoistic in its need for space and light. The animal runs on instinct, senses, but without that higher moral choice.
And humans. We also say I am, but there's a difference.
A crucial one. Our capacity for understanding and consciously choosing to follow divine law. We're not just driven by instinct or physics. We can grasp the why and choose to align with it.
That ability to choose consciously is the key.
It's what defines the human stage, yeah.
Which leads nicely to this talk with the angel, a step further up the ladder.
Right. The angel represents a much more evolved state, but still, infinitely far from God's perfection.
And the lesson there is?
Greater understanding brings greater duty. Evolved beings are basically instruments of divine love, focused entirely on service, on the progress of others.
So their joy isn't like our earthly joys.
No, he contrasts it. Earthly joys often have that ego tinge. The angel's bliss is an active, selfless work stemming from a much deeper connection to the divine plan.
A hierarchy of service, then. Interesting. Now, what about form? He talks about forms constantly changing, but this unchanging I at the core.
Yeah, he looks at the universe birth, death, renewal, constant flux, but insists that inside every being there's this immutable I, the core self.
The bit that feels like me, even though my body's changed completely since childhood.
Exactly that persistent sense of identity. And his logic is, if this I survives all those changes, why wouldn't it survive the change of death?
And this I isn't just for humans.
Nope. He argues it's universal. Everything, from atoms to galaxies, has this principle of individualization, this core I-ness. It's fundamental.
Okay, so if my I am is my soul, what's the I am of the whole universe?
Following that logic, Ubaldi says the I am of the universe, the animating principle of the biggest form there is. That's God.
And the universe is like God's body, expressing his thought.
Kind of. Like, we read someone's face, we can study creation, its laws, its beauty, its complexity, to get a sense of God's physiognomy, his thought made manifest.
So science and mysticism are both ways of reading that.
Exactly. Two different approaches to probing the same divine thought. Science does it through observation, experiment, discovering the laws. Mysticism aims for a more direct, intuitive grasp of that same thought, maybe through visions or deep contemplation.
Fascinating way to link them. Okay, let's talk about behavior, the involuted versus the evolved being.
Yeah.
Egoism versus altruism.
Right. The involuted being is still caught up in matter, focused on self-survival. The evolved being understands the bigger picture, the interconnectedness, the link to the divine center.
So altruism might look like a loss to the ego.
But the evolved being gets it. They understand the system, the rewards of giving, of radiating love. It leads to greater fulfillment, a stronger connection to God.
And this ties into the gospel message, love thy neighbor.
Perfectly. Ubaldi saw it as totally aligned with how the universe actually works. He admitted it seems utopian to our often ego-driven world,
Yeah, it definitely feels that way sometimes.
but he insisted his own experimental observation over 40 years confirmed its deep, practical truth. When you live it, he suggests, its reality becomes tangible.
Wow. Okay, back to the fall for a moment. He connects his idea to those biblical bits about fallen angels.
Yeah, passages in Jude and Peter about angels not keeping their original state. He saw his intuition about a fall from a pure spiritual state, driven by pride, echoed in those scriptures.
A descent from the center, God to the periphery.
Exactly. And being out there on the periphery means loss, an inversion of qualities.
How so?
Well, think. Freedom at the center becomes limitation at the edge. Life becomes stagnation or death. Truth warps into error. Peace becomes conflict. It's a diminished state further from the source.
But crucially, God isn't absent even there. Immanence.
Super important point. God remains present, latent within the fallen creature, maybe very deep, less conscious the further down you are into matter.
He contrasts the limited paths of atoms with the freedom of spirit.
Right. Atoms have minimal freedom, closed trajectories. Energy is more open. Spirit has maximal freedom. Matter, in this view, becomes almost the focal point of negativity, Satan's realm in a sense.
Which leads to this idea of two universes, a perfect spiritual one and this imperfect material one.
Yes, but they're interconnected. The material one is like a shadow, evolving back towards the perfection of the spiritual original. It got fragmented by the fall.
But they're destined to merge back together.
Driven by God's immanence, yes. His presence within the material universe guides it back. They aren't separate realities, just two aspects temporarily divided, striving for reunion.
In all the dualism we see, good devil, light dark, stems from that original split.
That's the argument. It repeats at every level. Unity only comes by reconciling these opposites. Our own struggles, internal and external, reflect this creative tension. It's a genesis through struggle, ultimately leading back to one.
Ubaldi also really emphasizes repetition, cycles. Why is that so central?
Because observing these repeating patterns, micro to macro, lets us understand the whole system. The cycles, growth, decay, rebirth, are driven by that inner divine impulse pushing against resistance. It creates a rhythm, a harmony.
He even mentioned a curvature of time.
Yeah, alongside space, suggesting time itself might loop or echo, contributing to these repetitions, to tradition. It's how the absolute keeps acting within the relative fragmented world.
Okay, so we have this journey back to the center, and he describes two main ways to get there, direct and indirect.
That's right, the direct path. You love God, follow the system willingly. It's smoother, freer.
And the indirect.
That's the path of rebellion, separation. You head out into the chaos. It inevitably involves suffering, learning the hard way, experiencing good and evil, paying for mistakes.
But you still get back eventually.
Yes, both paths lead to perfection. But the indirect path, having known both sides, leads to a deeper, more conscious perfection, forged in experience. The system's so perfect, he says, even error becomes part of the conquest.
Even mistakes serve the grand plan. That's comforting, in a way.
It's a profound idea that nothing is truly wasted in the cosmic economy.
And the ultimate endgame. What happens when evil is finally overcome?
The fallen spirits return, redeemed, to their original state. But now they have the knowledge gained from the journey. They know why obedience works, why separation hurts.
So no more falling.
That's the idea. It becomes a higher determinism, choosing good freely because you deeply understand it. Love, the original creative force, triumphs completely. The universe reunites. And there's joy whenever a part returns to the whole.
He also uses this phrase, progressive demolition and reconstruction. Sounds intense.
It's his way of describing the descent from spirit to matter as a kind of flattening of dimensions. It's symbolic, hard for our 3D minds to picture fully.
And evolution is the rebuilding.
Exactly. The spirit gradually reclaiming matter, reconstructing the system dimension by dimension, step by step, back towards the original fullness.
Let's revisit that God versus Satan idea, the battle between good and evil.
Again, Satan isn't an equal opponent. It's the negative principle within beings, opposing God's positive principle. Darkness, unconsciousness, matter, involution versus light consciousness, spirit, evolution.
And this battle happens inside us and out in the world.
Constantly. But the nature of the system itself guarantees God's ultimate victory. It's inherent in the design.
And for Ubaldi, the only way to make sense of all this, the pain, the evil, the dualism, alongside a good God, is the theory of the fall.
He argued passionately for that. Without the fall, he felt, the universe is just a bundle of contradictions. How could a good God create this mess directly? The fall provides the necessary explanation for the starting point of our current reality.
And critically, God doesn't punish us for separating.
That's crucial. What feels like punishment is just the automatic consequence of choosing to disconnect from the source of life. Rebellion is spiritual self-harm. It leads to a loss of being, potentially even annihilation of the individual consciousness, though the underlying substance, being from God, persists.
And reincarnation fits neatly into this cycle.
Perfectly. The cycles of life, death, mistakes, corrections, it mirrors and supports the larger cosmic cycle of fall and resurrection that's fundamental to his whole system. A purely progressive creation theory wouldn't account for this cyclical nature, he felt.
Okay, what about sublimation? What is it, and why might modern psychology misunderstand it?
Sublimation is the way out, the path back, correcting the anti-system by moving from the periphery towards the center, towards God, escaping the pain.
But psychology might see it as denial, regression.
Because, Ubaldi thought, our current psychology is often rooted in this materialistic end-of-cycle phase. From that inverted perspective, moving towards spirit can look like moving away from real life, like annihilation. Truth seems upside down until you start the ascent.
So where does that leave humanity right now, in his view?
Sort of sitting amidst our own mess, our self-made ruins.
Yeah.
But still holding that divine spark, the soul, still having that deep, maybe unconscious pull towards ascent.
And God helps.
Absolutely. Sends guidance, the living example Christ showing the way back through sacrifice, through love. It's an ongoing battle within us, good versus evil. But God's power is ultimately working towards resolution.
You mentioned involution as immobilization, evolution as liberation. Can you expand on that?
Involution is getting stuck, bound by limits, becoming less conscious, more material. Evolution is breaking free, expanding consciousness, gaining spiritual freedom.
And that image of Lucifer frozen in ice.
That's the ultimate symbol of that immobilization. The negation of life, of movement, trapped at the furthest point from the vibrant center.
Ubaldi also saw connections between his ideas and modern science's view of matter, didn't he?
He did. He pointed out how physics was showing matter wasn't solid stuff, but energy, dissolving into waves, fields, almost abstract thought or information.
Like the electron being a wave bundle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He suggested the fundamental reality might be something like a pure electromagnetic field, challenging the old idea of an inert material base. Matter becomes condensed energy, which is expressed thought.
Wow. And he even reinterpreted the Trinity through the lens of creation.
Yeah, as three phases of one act. First moment, ear thought, abstract concept, the Father.
Okay.
Second moment, idea becomes action, kinetic energy, will the Word, the Son.
Right.
Third moment, the idea and an action, fully expressed, inform the Spirit. He saw this reflected in John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word.
And this makes God's immanence, his presence in creation, totally logical.
A logical necessity of that triune structure. The initial idea continues right through into the form. It has to remain connected. It also fits with science's idea of substance energy being indestructible.
And Christ's sacrifice, how does that fit into this bigger picture?
He saw it symbolically. The Word, second moment, becoming form, third moment, a self-sacrifice within creation. But also, it mirrors the bigger sacrifice of God following the fallen spirits into the fall imminence to work for their return through evolution.
So Christ's passion reflects God's cosmic passion.
In a way, yes, a moment within a much larger divine effort. And the Eucharist becomes the symbol of God's ongoing imminent presence within humanity for regeneration, for redemption.
And the core message, Christ brought love, is the engine of that reconstruction.
Absolutely. Love is the quality of the center. Christ brought it to the periphery, fragmented by hate and separation. Love one another is the formula for rebuilding the fractured one. It was a call to action for humanity.
And revealing God as love was a step up from the Old Testament image.
Part of humanity's evolving consciousness, yeah. Moving from a God primarily of justice or power to a God understood fundamentally as love.
So how does original sin fit in? And redemption?
Christ's coming rectifies humanity's state after the fall, original sin being our inheritance of that initial angelic fall's consequences. Christ's descent and passion mirrors God's much larger descent and passion for the whole fallen universe's redemption.
That Augustine quote comes to mind again. Seeking thee without, while thou wast within me.
Perfectly captures it. Ubaldi's urging us, wake up to the divine within. Recognize your own spiritual nature, your immortality as God's child. Suffering comes from misunderstanding the system. Overcoming lower instincts transforms it into joy.
The message is, God is here, with us, now.
Yes, not distant. The driving force of life, growth, Humanity's slow crawl towards being more civilized, more aware, that's evidence of this inner divine nature emerging. Remember Jesus saying, ye are gods, derived from God's substance.
Let's loop back to the Eucharist one more time, the breaking of bread.
Symbolizes that initial division of the one into duality, the necessary prelude to immanence. And Christ's ongoing spiritual presence in it signifies God's constant immanence for our regeneration.
Okay, this evolutionary scale matter up to Superman, with God as the reference point. What's the core idea?
It's the reconstruction process. Even in dead matter, God's thought is latent. Evolution is the awakening of that divine consciousness within beings. Greater awakening means greater participation in God's intelligence, moving back towards a full freedom and consciousness of the center God.
And atheism, then, is fundamentally
Denying the source of life itself. It leads towards separation, towards non-being, the anti-system. The punishment is simply the loss of God, the loss of connection to being.
And creation isn't a one-shot deal.
No, it's continuous, ongoing, powered by God's immanence. Unlike our creations that need constant upkeep, God's creation is alive, constantly unfolding from within.
Even the cycles of youth and old age in life reflect this.
Smaller echoes of the big cycle. Spirit organizes form, youth, growth, then form yields back to spirit, age, decline, enriching consciousness, immanence working alongside transcendence.
So understanding immanence is the key to seeing God's action, even when he seems distant.
It bridges that gap. Shows his action isn't remote intervention, but the constant internal force driving everything.
Finally, Ubaldi's own method, intuition. How did he see it?
Distinct from, say, mediumship or basic psychic stuff, for him it was a personal awakening of deeper consciousness, a direct knowing of God's thought, the universe's structure, the law.
Not science, but complementary.
Exactly. A different way to access truth, providing the overarching principles, a big picture that science then explores experimentally.
And as beings evolve, their individual eyes become less distinct.
Yeah, they start merging into larger currents of thought. Ners, he called them, reflecting the reunification of the one that got fractured. Less separate ego, more participation in the cosmic consciousness.
And he felt understanding all this wasn't just abstract philosophy, but actually important for us.
Critically important. For solving humanity's problems, for our survival, for guiding our evolution consciously. Knowledge of our place in the cosmos is practical, essential.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the core message seems to be this profound unity. All beings interconnected, returning to the one, to God.
Exactly. And the path is simple, yet incredibly hard. Loving your neighbor. That act itself is the journey of unification, recognizing the divine link between all souls.
It's definitely a lot to take in. You can see why Ubaldi might have been cautious about sharing these ideas widely.
Yeah, the potential for misunderstanding is huge. He presented it in a dense way, maybe aimed at those ready for that level of complexity, those with, as he might say, ears to hear.
Maybe these chaotic times we're in are part of that evolutionary exercise he talked about.
Could be seen that way, a necessary phase. What's clear is that Ubaldi offered a massive, comprehensive vision. For anyone listening who resonates with these big questions, his work provides, well, a lifetime of contemplation. He felt the time had come for these truths to be spoken more openly, at least to those evolved enough to grapple with them.
A challenging and thought-provoking journey through God and universe definitely leaves you with a lot to think about.